So hello, welcome everyone. We have 20 people in the room, which is great. And we are tasked with, as part of the UCL Algo 2020 conference, I was asked to put together something on governance. I should say just a bit about who I am. So I'm an associate professor in science and technology studies at UCL, and I'm interested in the relationships between science, technology, society, politics. And I thought that it would be, given that the topic was artificial intelligence, algorithmic society, and all the rest of it, I thought it would be nice just to give a bit of a focus to this discussion and concentrate on the question of hype. I think hype is worthy of serious discussion, right? It's sort of easy to think about hype as just exuberance or, just uncontained optimism, right? We might point at Elon Musk and say, oh, that guy, always making predictions. But we still regard hype as a sort of frivolous and slightly frothy thing. And in this discussion, what I would really like to do with the panel is just explore what hype means. Is it good? Is it bad? Who gets left out? Who are the winners and losers from hype? And have a slightly more serious conversation about it. Obviously, there's a long and illustrious history of hype and AI machine learning. In the 60s, 70s, you had people like Herbert Simon and Marvin Minsky talking about how a superhuman intelligence was just around the corner. It was just a matter of getting the programming right. Now, as AI has become more of a political economic concern, where the stakes are just as high, but maybe people are more interested in the money that's got to be made. Maybe that some of that hype has diminished, but maybe it's just taken on different forms. I have a panel here of 4 speakers, which is great. They are from around Europe, which is also great. It's the nice thing about being able to do these things on Zoom for all their limits. Let me just say a bit about who they are, and then I'll ask them each to do sort of 3 to 5 minutes of what they think the big issues, concerns are, and then we can run the conversation from there. So I will introduce them. Just before I do, let me just say, in terms of getting all of you involved in the discussion, we have an hour. If you do have questions or comments to plug in, the easiest way to do that is through the chat box on Zoom. If you would like to stick up a hand and either show your face on camera and wave at me, or raise a blue virtual hand on Zoom, then do it that way. And I'll try to make sure that those get fed into the discussion. So our panel, we start with Gemma Milne, who, as well as being having recently joined UCL Science and Technology Studies, is author of a brilliant book called Smoke and Mirrors: How Hype Obscures the Future and How to See Past It. We have Dorothea Bauer, who is a consultant working on ethics, responsibility, and artificial intelligence, among other things. And she's currently based in the Swiss Alps, which is nice. Next, we have Harry van Lente, who is a professor of science and technology studies at the University of Maastricht, and has written, probably more and more intelligently than anybody, about the role that hype and expectations play in shaping science and technology. And finally, Ramona Moro, who is just joined UCL's Department of History of Art, where he studies, among other things, race and digital culture. And I will ask them to go in that order, starting with Gemma, to kick us off. So Gemma, over to you.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for the invite. This is a cool panel. I thought I would start, seeing as I'm first, with a little bit of like, what is hype? Because I thought that would be a really easy question to answer when I decided to write a book on hype. I thought, I know what hype is. Obviously, you can write a book on this. This is easy. And very quickly realized that actually it's quite difficult to define, at least in a way that makes sense to everybody, because it seems everybody has a sort of slightly different definition or idea of it in their head. And the way I think about it is really you have to separate hype from disinformation, misinformation, fake news, whatever you want to call it. And perhaps you could argue that the difference is around intention. So hype is not necessarily intended to deceive, whereas things like disinformation, misinformation, fake news there's a level of deliberateness in the falsity or in the lying. But really the way that I think about hype is around the concept of fooling. So if you think about it in terms of magic, so if you go to a magic show, you are consenting to be fooled. You're walking into the room and saying, hello, Mr. Magician, or Mrs. Magician, please try to fool me. I might sit here and try and work out how you did it, or I might just enjoy the entertainment of being fooled. But either way, I'm saying it's okay for you to try and trick me. If you're being lied to, you could argue that that's non-consensual fooling. And the way I think about hype is that it can sometimes result in accidental fooling. And the way that it kind of results in this accidental fooling is normally to do with context. So the person's putting out a particular message to, normally to try and get attention. And on the receiving end of that message, something has been lost in translation, whether that's because there's not enough information in the message or the person doesn't have the specific type of expertise or type of background, or is situated in a particular kind of community in which this message suddenly means something quite different. So I really think about this idea of context and nuance, and when you see these sort of hyped up messages, how do you kind of think about the context in which they're put in? And I guess that this sort of, Jack said about whether hype is good or bad. The way I kind of land on is really that's a lot to do with kind of your moralistic view of the world, really, because you can argue that hype is sometimes used for good, depending on what you think good is, and sometimes it's used for bad, because I think of it as a tool, and it is a tool specifically for grabbing attention. It's not a tool for full understanding. And the problem is when people don't realize that hype is being used as a tool simply for attention, and rather thinking that this tool is about giving information. That's where I see the kind of bad decisions can possibly happen, whether that's political, financial, or social. But I always kind of come back to the sort of moralistic side, and whether you think it's okay to use hype as a sort of placebo, if you will, to try and get to ultimately what is a good end. So maybe I'll leave it at that point. Cheers.
That's a brilliant start. Thank you, Gemma. Dorothea, can I come to you? Oh, you're muted, Dorothea. There you go.
Just was reminded. So yeah, I'm going to outline 4 points about the AI hype specifically that are problematic from an ethical perspective. And they're on top of classical AI ethics problems, I would say. So first of all, the AI hype epitomizes the belief that we need AI for everything, or at least that AI makes always sense. It does not question the very purpose of AI. Yet when you look around, there's a lot of what I call AI for nonsense. So AI for nonsense is a term that comes into my mind whenever I read about some AI innovation where any evidence of real progress is missing, such as when Walmart uses AI to ensure that products are in stock and fresh, but where that AI application pumps out 1.6 terabyte of data per second. In that case, that seems to be just AI for the sake of AI. And another example for AI for nonsense is an AI application that discovers, for example, when you light a cigarette at a gas station. That's where you really think like, wow, every technological augmentation is an amputation. It feels like an amputation of common sense. And if we really start to forget some basic principles of survival and delegate this task to AI, we're really doomed. And so evidently the ethical problems here is undermining our autonomy and distracting resources away from real world problems. And second, there is a lot of misleading promises. They can be found behind headlines like AI will end poverty, AI resolves climate change, AI finds your perfect romantic match, etc. And unfortunately, such misleading promises can also often be found in the debates about AI for good. So these headlines are often linked to this technological solutionist mindset, where you think that even the most wicked problems can be resolved with technology alone. But whenever we read such a headline, we really need to ask ourselves, what is the problem exactly? And what is AI really contributing to it? Because it's impossible to solve wicked problems like climate change or poverty with technology alone. AI can help to solve proxy problems, such as, it can predict extreme weather events, and this can help plan your crops, etc. But it cannot resolve climate change. It cannot free us from our responsibility to change our lifestyles. And third, even though I'm very critical of an excessive or even exclusive impact orientation, which in itself is a hype when you look at sustainable investments, for example, I think in the case of AI, some more impact orientation would be helpful, because AI hype is basically the opposite of impact, particularly when it refers to scenarios like those presented by Musk with his brain implants that replace human communication, etc. Such scenarios, again, direct energy and resources and emissions away at something that is barely tangible, that's far away in the future, and that carries a huge number of ethical risks. So if we adapt an impact-oriented perspective instead, we always need to ask, who will be affected in what way by currently hyped AI, who bears the costs, and what are the unintended consequences? And fourth and final, AI hype is also epitomized by stories that vastly exaggerate the capabilities of AI in the present, when effectively it's humans that are still doing most of the work. So like, we have all read these stories about ghost workers that are manually training algorithms under dire working conditions. So presenting something as machine intelligence when it's actually human labor, human intelligence, is also dishonest, and it deprecates the humans doing the real work. So these are just 4 points that come on top of all the other issues we have, like bias, discrimination, etc. And they even often aggravate the existing issues. My 5 cents on that.
Thank you very much, Dorothea.
A huge amount of ground covered there, and also a nice segue for me to just mention my virtual background here. Some of you will have noted that this is the penultimate scene of The Wizard of Oz, where the wizard himself is revealed by Toto, and the amazing line, "Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain," said by the man behind the curtain. I think it's a nice illustration of hype and hidden labor. Harro, on to you, please.
Yes, thank you. So I would really like to continue what the other two already started. So and I think my first point would be that hype is really part of the dynamic. So it's whether you like it or not, it's just part of it, and it's part of every technological change. In some, it's more than others, depending on how controversial and sexy and public and so on. So you could call it the overshoot. So you always need attention to get started, and to have to oversell before something can really start. So that's part of the dynamic. It's unavoidable. So it's there. The second point I would like to raise is that all the participants know it. They know there is this game that people oversell, and so the term hype typically refers to that you are smarter than the others. You know that it's maybe not true, but the others believe it. So, and when everybody is saying that, then you get particular games where people try to smart out each other, and that you feel, well, there is something going on and I cannot afford to miss it. So all the others believe it, but I don't believe it. But well, still, I cannot miss the train. I cannot miss the boat, whatever metaphors you will see. So even people who do not believe it, they feel there is a pressure to respond and to come with good arguments why they would not continue with it. And that's often is not there. So you have to somehow say something as a firm, a government, a researcher, and so on. So that's part of the dynamic. Yeah, so it's so people know it's there, and they have to do something with it. And there are all kinds of ways in which that is done with the hype cycles, and Gartner, who will sell all kinds of strategic information, and so even when people know it's a hype, it still has huge consequences. So you have these yeah, so you cannot miss trains. And well, the irony is that without the fear of missing the train, there would be no train. So that's so, because people feel we cannot afford not to spend time on it. It's not to miss it out. They will invest and so on. So that leads to my last point, that in a way we're all prisoners of these promises. Even when you are smarter than the others, when you believe it, then still it makes sense that you are really keen on not missing the boats, because there are boats. But because everybody is having these kinds of calculations, then still there will be a boat. And in a sense, we as observers, STS researchers, innovation studies, economists, we also are a bit part of that prisoner's position, because we also focus on, well, let's look at AI because everybody's talking about it, and we cannot afford not to look at AI because, well, we are supposed to follow all this. Whereas I think that the real question we should ask, and that's our obligation, that's our normative mandate, I guess, is that the question should not be what will AI achieve in the long term. So what will happen to AI is not the question, but what will happen to the world? What kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of things are needed? And so that ties in with the ethical concerns of Dorothea, but it's well, it also points to the ironic situation that even us are somehow imprisoned by these expectations. So that's my 3 points.
Thank you very much, Harro.
Excellent. And Ramon, finally.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. I want to take a slightly different turn to think about this idea of hype. You know, I really liked how you know, Gemma was describing it as a type of magic, as a type of consent to be filled. And we all know that, you know, hype is a type of blatant and sort of sensational promotion of something. But I want to take a turn away from the application of machine learning and AI as a sort of function of hype within this relationship with the human, and think about more so about what I would like to call kind of the audacity of hype. And what I mean by that is this type of, I think Gemma also mentioned this type of carrying of the message. As the other panelists have been very fruitful in saying, you know, we have these sort of, these mechanisms, these tools that have been infused with our cultural, political, economic milieus. They have actionable responses and produce ethical implications in those actionable responses. And those ethical implications get obscured by this idea of hype, which has to do with commercial desire, our own desires for those things, you know, own desires for efficiency, optimization, so on and so forth. So I really like this idea of the train, you know, the existence of the train and our necessity to have an effectual experience, even to bring that train into reality. But really what I want to highlight is this type of, you know, AI and machine learning being this tool for grabbing attention. And this is what I call in the audacity of hype. Because what we've seen in the historicity, you know, well before what we know as machine learning and AI, which we know is developed in the, you know, 50s, but, you know, it has a very sticky relationship to statistics, pattern recognition, deep learning, so on and so forth. So, you know, part of the hype is thinking that these are new innovations and new technologies, but they're actually a continuation of quantifiable logics and attempts to use data and to use calculation in order to understand certain types of natural, human, or non-human types of phenomenon. And what we see in that type of phenomenon is a different type of obscurity, or what I should say, for me, is a different type of obscurity. And what I mean by this is those of us that are involved in the type of ethics of AI, you know, we do have a tendency to focus retrospectively on that which disadvantages us. You know, certain communities certain outlets, certain things. And this is retrospective, of course, because these happen after the implementation of a certain AI system, or after a type of press conference by Elon Musk, as you're saying, Jack, that's there. But really what I want to draw attention to is sort of the flip side of that, and actually how hype can be useful, because in one sense, these mechanisms illuminate the ethical deficits we have as a social people. And in another sense, it illuminates the ethical implications that we have as a people. We know during its primary functions, its mathematical and algorithmic functions, in many cases, the only thing that these algorithms can do is replicate and mimic almost our existing social deficits and our existing discomforts in the types of relationships that we have. In terms of race and racialization, what it does is AI does not create race or racism. AI does not perpetuate race and racism. What it does is it amplifies the existing race and racism that already exists within our cultural milieu. So then what gets obscured, that's what I'm calling the audacity of hype, because hype is what allows us to continue to take a distance from those human to human processes that have already been in place well before AI, right? It allows us a place, it becomes a repository. It becomes a sensational sort of bucket of promotion. If we were to consider this train, then this train actually becomes that which we can transplant our existing social problems onto, create a type of focus on that as a deception, as a type of mirroring, as something that's a distraction from us. And meanwhile, we're actually, if we're to use this Wizard of Oz trick, we are the wizard. Because when we created AI, we created actually a curtain which would allow us to put all of the racism, all of the homophobia, all of the misogyny behind that curtain. And then we let the robot reveal itself. And then we can take a position and say, aha, look what it's done. And it creates this type of proximity that then says that now I can interact with this mechanism, this machinic, to try to solve what we as humans have shown we're incapable of solving. So when I say it's the kind of audacity of hype, is really, for me, the deficit of hype is the audacity that it might reveal that which we cannot see ourselves. And at the same time, we do see it, which to me indicates a certain uncertainty with how we deal with things like racism and misogyny and all those types of mechanisms that become the sticky, dark side of our sociality. And it's very easy to put that sociality into something that amplifies it. But if we look at it in the opposite sense, that which is amplifying is also giving us an opportunity to realize actually the intensity in which these mechanisms have unfolded, right? And we see these types of, processes. And I think why it becomes important to think about the historicity of machine learning and AI and these things called hype is actually, if we see it as a continuation of logics that have just become, or technologies that have just become more sophisticated, if we neutralize those, what are we left with are processes in which we're not trying to understand the world. We're trying to actually distract from our understanding of ourselves. And so as long as we push to actually make an AI that's this sort of ethical AI or an AI for good, it becomes this kind of, I like Harold when you said, we're a prisoner of our own illusions. It's that which is the illusion that actually this mechanism can either be that which is our salvation, or Sylvia Winter calls it our ceremony that's going to save us, or that which can give us insight into something that we need to understand, when in fact what we see as a reality is its mimicry of that which we already understand. Basically, and a machine learning algorithm cannot actually produce a pattern which we don't already comprehend. So I'll sort of leave it as that.
Thanks, Ramon. That's
Brilliant. I'm really struck by this thing that you draw attention to. But one way, I guess, of challenging hype is to ask, well, is it as new as you say it is? Whoever you are, the purveyor of hype, and this critique of AI, that it may actually be an intensely conservative thing, not the progressive, disruptive thing that it sort of pretends to be, is really interesting. And I sort of see the connection there with what Harro was saying about, you know, maybe we, the sort of people that get involved in this sort of discussion by jumping on the bandwagon, or you know, talking about, you know, the train of inevitable technological development, maybe we become part of that problem rather than asking the more fundamental questions. Wow, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground, and we're still less than halfway through. We've sort of clearly problematized hype, right? It's an issue for us, but following you know, a couple of you, I mean, it's also a sort of fact of innovative life that to just pretend that we can wish it away is naive. If we do think that it's bad, let me just start off by asking, well, whoever wants to jump in, and because you're all polite, intelligent people, you can just jump in, however, without me telling you. Whose responsibility is it? I guess that's my question, because I hear a lot from scientists saying, oh, well, hype is a construction of the media, right? Whose responsibility is hype? Who wants to take that on?
I don't mind jumping in. This is something I think I've thought a lot about during the book, because when I was writing it, I was a journalist, and I was like, wait, is this me? Am I writing about me? And I think that there's no one, the way I landed is there's no one party that is responsible. I think that there are elements of the way that the media works, whether it's due to business models or particular individuals or whatever, that is obviously really problematic in terms of how we write headlines, how we monetize media. We know all this stuff, right? There's certainly lots to be said there. One of the things that I always try and bring up, and particularly, I guess, in my previous life when I was spending a lot of time at startup conferences, was talking about the ego that is part of hype, the kind of wanting your idea or your company or you as a person, if you're a founder or CEO, to be whatever it is. And, you know, I would always get a lot of startup founders being like, how can I get into Wired? How can I get my startup featured in Wired or TechCrunch? And I was like, why do you want that? Is it because you want business, or is it because you want fame? And those are different things. So I think that there's a complicity and a responsibility there in the people that want the hype in the first place to really think, this is a tool for attention. Do you need it because you need customers, you need hires? You know, why do you actually need it? Because there's some things that's fair play and there's others that are not. But I think, you know, not to be just say it's everybody's fault. I do think that there's a huge amount of responsibility in citizens. The idea of how we read and how we take information and how much digging we do on the ideas that are presented to us. And I suppose that's kind of where I always come back to with this is why we do have to have serious conversations about hype and not just see it as this flippant thing that's done to us. This is a thing that exists within society. And if we think that it's somebody else's fault, it's the robot's fault, it's the AI's fault, it's the media's fault, we're not really looking at, well, what does it mean to believe or to back something or to be a fan of something or whatever. And that's a really personal sort of thing. And so I think there's a sort of citizen duty in the same way that there's a duty to vote. Why don't we have a duty to critically think? That's something that I kind of think a little bit about when it comes to responsibility.
Maybe I could push the panel and again, maybe somebody else jump in on this. So, you know, if we did think, well, this is clearly the responsibility of innovators themselves, at least partially, it's not just a media construction, it's not just flim-flam. And yet there's almost no accountability for hype. You know, when Elon Musk gets his predictions wrong, misses his deadlines, we can't say, there you go, you're going to suffer either in terms of your personal reputation or in terms of some other sanction or even your share price. I wonder, Gemma, whether, you know, the separation between whether attention and business are becoming more intertwined.
It comes back though to not to just be like it's always about what you think right and wrong is, because you can boil everything down to that. But you know, whenever I've been doing talks about the book, and it's particularly when I'm doing it in very sort of techno optimist circles, I mean, you know this, we did one together where the sort of pushback was, but it's good that Elon Musk has this superpower because he's doing good things, and so therefore hype as a superpower is, you know, he's worth it. And my kind of pushback is, well, when did we decide as society? I don't think we did, but that certain people are allowed to use this without this, as you say, accountability. And then it comes back to, well, what is it we're trying to, you know, it's, we can't all agree as a society what we all want all the time and what we all believe is a good society. But if you have certain people in power who have an understanding of hype, I mean, a lot of this is about understanding marketing. You know, this is like a thing you can study, right? And there's a level of like only certain people having that, either money to spend on it, time to spend on it, intellect, training, whatever you want to call it, to manufacture hype. So, you know, there's a sort of who gets to do it for what reason and who's allowing it for what reason, you know, ends justify means, all that kind of stuff too. So yes, attention and business, yes, are the same thing, but to some degree, but I don't think that's a separate conversation around the kind of accountability, responsibility thing, because it ultimately comes back to, like, as a society, what do we agree is justified by whatever tool we end up using? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Ramon, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I would say, I really like those comments, but I would say that we agreed a long time ago. We agreed because if we look historically at every amplification of our latest, since modernity, even prior to modernity, what we call modernity, even if we look at sort of this hype that we attach to any mechanism, these mechanisms are always the amplification of an existing agreement. They come about because we have agreed. Because we have agreed that colonization is the method of discovery of the planet, and then because we agree that it's only by law that process ends, because we know that mechanism, right? When it comes to social issues, as long as it's made illegal, we just pretend like no one feels that way anymore, right? They lost the war, so fascism's gone away, right? But even if you look at Elon Musk, this example of colonizing Mars, of colonizing the ground and the earth as we know it, and the air, and so on and so forth, if we look at the rhetorics of even how he talks about it, it's actually right in line with how we've always talked about colonization, how we've always talked about those mechanisms. And then if we look back at those historical periods, it wasn't that nations just colonized other nations. It wasn't that they embarked in the slave trade. It wasn't that there were human rights violations against queer people and trans people. These were based on social agreements and justifications that these were the right things to do at the time. And so the same gentleman that's saying, well, we need Elon Musk to do this. I mean, I used to live in Austria, and I have a friend who lives in Western Austria, and there's still people who think about the war in terms of infrastructure. Well, we know these bad things happen, but man, the roads got fixed, right? and you see that, not to pick on that specific incident, but I guess that's what I mean about this audacity of hype. It's only for some reason now in 2020 with AI that we then think that we're somehow being duped and distracted away from a social agreement that hasn't been had, when really this social agreement has never gone away. We've always agreed that that the mechanisms of expansion, the mechanisms of technological progress, and the deficits of those who fall out of those processes was always in the purview of a few. And those few depend upon a certain type of collective body of understanding and goodwill, that then that mechanisms get sold, and then they leave us poor social scientists to clean up the mess afterwards, and then everyone ignores us for 200 years, and then we start over, right?
I'm really so. I mean, Gemma, your subtitle of your book is How Hype Obscures the Future. Ramon's suggestion, I guess, the possibility, and Ramon, I don't know how optimistic you are about this possibility being realized, is that I guess hype might have this sort of democratizing function by at least bringing visibility to some things that do get so easily obscured because they are inconvenient or too hard for us to talk about or value laden or all the rest of it. I wonder if Harro, Dorothea, you have sort of thoughts on the possibilities for hype as a way to open up the discussion rather than just to close it down and privatize it.
Yeah, so well, first of all, I would like to warn us that we should not focus too much on those who are highly visible, like Elon Musk. And I think these are, well, those are tips of the iceberg. And the iceberg is that companies and within companies and researchers, they always need attention to start anything. And so hype is a side effect of that structure. So it will always happen. And on top of that, you will see highly visible people, and they will and I agree with Ramon that there's also a tip of the iceberg of the repertoires that they use that are so deeply embedded in what we already feel and hope and things like that. So the two tips of the iceberg, so to speak. And then I think I can come back to your question, Jack, that if we see those repertoires and those people voicing it as well, just phrasing what we already hope and believe, then indeed it's a sort of mirror. Is this really what we hope and believe? Is this the best we can think of the future? Is this the most inspiring and daring thing of what will become of us? So we should not be naive that we can choose whatever we want, but we can be naive and not in ignoring that we are all doing this together and somehow we are part of it. So we should really have a look at how we are part of these trains, so to speak, and we're all doing it ourselves, and we cannot just at will stop it, but we can examine how we are part of it. So and then there's the way to open it, I think.
Thank you.
I'd also say that it's kind of all these, like the visible hype by the tips of the icebergs, are like invitations for us and also obligations to join the discussion and to deliberate whether we want to take that next step together. I mean, someone's just putting it out there. I don't see it as much as just a replicating continuity, as Ramon says. Often I think it's pushing boundaries. It's taking elements from old thought patterns, but it's applying them to so far unknown domains, like, you know, Musk and the brain implant. Of course, we have always been striving to optimize ourselves, but no one ever wanted to really touch the brain. So whatever step is taken or suggested by these hype makers is an invitation or an obligation for us to critically, pick it up and see, do we want to push that boundary further? And so the visible hype is actually it's not democratizing. It's an invitation to debate, but maybe there's also hype that we cannot even see, like hype among investors that are more like in the hiding, where maybe more dangerous things happen. So that's another side of the story. We're just talking about the public, like the tips of the iceberg, as Harro said.
Yes, conscious that there's sort of
closed door hype going on, and maybe that's where the resources are getting moved around, both cultural and financial resources. Now we've got some questions coming in from the audience, which is great. Micah has very patiently had her hand up, so I want to ask her to come in first, and then I will summarize some of the questions from the audience so that our panel can respond. But Micah, come in.
Thank you so much. I had a question because you've mentioned that there's been repeated waves of interest in AI, and we've seen the hype coming back over and over again. But I was wondering why the historical amnesia? Why do people keep on forgetting about the previous use of AI? Is this purposeful or accidental? I would love to hear your thoughts on why we forget.
Great question. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's extraordinary. Ramon, did you want to come in first?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to take that one. Thank you for that question, because I'm sort of fascinated by that question. I think that's why I'm so attracted to this type of genealogy of this type of replication, you know, and I think Dorothy is right. Like, it's not an exact replication. It just gets in a new, it's like a bad sci-fi film. It just gets re-articulated into a bad new robot, you know. But yeah, this type of cultural amnesia is something that I think, you know, obviously extends much further than the technological milieu. And it's something that within my research, you know, and I'm trying to actually locate, you know, where that is. And there have been attempts to try to locate this. So, you know, so one attempt was, you know, I think through a type of Sylvia Winter, you know, who is saying, you know, in the amplification of humanism, you know, because one of the downfalls of humanism was the dissolution of the divine. So basically, you know, everyone believed in the divine. It started to unravel. And then Sylvia Winter starts tracing that process to, in the absence of the divine, the sort of Anglo-European heterosexual male took the place of the divine, and then started to categorize systems and people according to that. And so they were looking for a ceremony in which to have that. And then now we see ourselves, this is what Sylvia Winter traces, now we see ourselves with the dissolution of even the Anglo-European heterosexual male. And she's saying we keep looking for the ceremony. We keep looking for that which will save us. And in looking for that which will save us, we tend to pocket, and this is where I come in and diverge from Winter, is I feel we tend to pocket that which we've already experienced as being a failure, because that which has arrived isn't the ceremony in which we expected. So we throw out, I think the cliche is we throw out the baby with the bathwater, we start a whole new mixture. And then, you know, we kind of are in this sort of neurotic, I think Mbembe would call it a delusion. He calls it a delusion. We're in this cycle of constantly trying to circumvent that which we have failed at. And in doing so, sort of take advantage. I think the other panelists sort of put into this, we tend to sort of reduce complicated problems and interactions, and then we sort of push them behind that curtain as a failure in themselves. And then we say, let's start over. And then we face that crises again because we encounter the same messiness that we try to discard. Right. And I put this in this lens intentionally because, you know, I feel this is what we see in elections, right?
Thank you, Ramon.
I mean, it's typical, you know, one person is supposed to, this is the day, all of a sudden in the history of the world and in America on January 1st, it's all supposed to get better.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we forget, let's forget everything else. And then by January 3rd, when the hangover has worn off, people are faced back again. And then what do? They put the failure within the candidate and he needs to go.
But we need these sort of collective delusions, don't we? And we need to tell ourselves that this time it'll be different.
And this time, right? Yeah, exactly. And that's actually, you know, and that has been why I'm fascinated with this question. And there have been many frameworks that try to break this. That's why part of my research goes into psychosocial for this reason, you know, because the research tries to, how do we break this cycle of neuroses, especially when we're actively involved in it. And for me, it sort of even goes back to that question of participation, because I'm fascinated by the person who goes to work at the NSA every day.
Yeah.
Like they actually get up in the morning, they have coffee, they have a commute, they tap their card in, knowing darn well what they're doing. But at the same time, are they bad people? You know, like, are they responsible for this and that? And what makes them decide or not decide? You know, I think us as scholars, we take for granted the rigor that we put into understanding the problems that are before us.
Well, before we get too self-congratulatory, there's one question that came into the chat that is really interesting from Danny. I think it was, if I've noted that one down, I just noted them down here. Who is talking about our complicity as researchers. You know, maybe in this conversation, this is us as sort of non-scientists talking about scientists or innovators. But I think, you know, researchers, we all might have to play a version of this game in which we are trying to mobilize, we're trying to seek attention, and then once we've got attention, do something with that attention, and we realize that there is a competition for that attention that might mean that if we want to convince the world that our research is worth funding, or that our findings are interesting, maybe we have to say that ours is better than somebody else's, and so that maybe that is there is a sort of vicious competition around hype. Let me just, so anybody that wants to take that up, I just want to throw in maybe 2 more questions and then ask panelists to just pick up on whichever bits they'd like to talk to. So Adam has a question about technology in higher education, which I sort of take as a sort of case of a broader set that's about systems that are seen as in some way broken or in need of reform, where along comes technology and appears to offer seductive and easy solutions. I mean, Dorothea, you mentioned solutionism, so maybe you want to come in on that one. There was also an interesting question that Manuel asked about hype as a sort of convenient distraction from the insolubility of so many of our wicked problems, right? That we just know that some of these things are too hard, and it's just too seductive to look for the solutionist alternative. So maybe who wants to come in on any of those? Maybe starting with you, Dorothea.
I'm really sorry, but you have to repeat the question. So you said, what is the technological solutionism of which actors? Sorry.
So the first one was about well, let's take them together. Why are solutionist hyped technological approaches so seductive for either problems that are too hard or systems that are seen as too complex and in need of reform?
Because I mean, it's very appealing to be relieved from our own human responsibility to change our behavior, to take a step back, to renounce. I mean, this year is the first year for many of us that we had to renounce on things that we couldn't just, go about our ways. So you can also see, in the coronavirus pandemic, there's also technological solutionism with all the contact tracing apps, etc. We want to be relieved, and it's very human, and we're always looking for win-win solutions. And so that's the promise of technological solutionism, that we can have it all. We can just continue with our way of life, and there is the miracle that resolves us from all responsibilities. I mean, I'd love that, but I just know it's not going to happen. It didn't happen with the contact tracing app, for sure. Not in Switzerland, at least. We still haven't gotten back our freedom.
Well, I think if we're having a competition for failed contact tracing apps, I think we in the UK will
I think you're winning. I admit that. I give it to you. You're winning. Yes. Okay.
Who else wants to come in on the solutionist question? Harro?
So, well, I would like to throw in also the more sociological perspective. So it's not just psychological that we are wired in a particular way as humans, so we prefer one thing over the other, but it's also that we are embedded in say systems of accountability. So a municipality, for instance, who needs to show somehow that they took things serious and that they care about the community, they are in need of something to endorse. So they have money, and so what to endorse? Well, if it's AI, because that's what people say that is the future, well, okay, that then maybe is a good bet, and you could even imagine that when they don't do this, and the neighboring community is that, then people are sort of, well, we're losing the race here, and why are we not responsible? And so all these pressures for people to show to each other that somehow they did something instead of just waiting and and hoping things will go better, or tiny things. So it's so there's. Yeah, so part of how we have devised our institutions, that's also part of the answer.
Great, thank you. Gemma or Ramon, feel free to jump in on this, or I can throw in some more of the questions.
Could I come in on, there's 2 in here, both Danny's one on complicity. And also Bill Cannon's asked a really interesting question about futures, and obviously I'm going to jump in on that because my research is on responsibility of futurists. So I think a lot about this kind of complicity. So just briefly, I guess, where I suppose when you've got to think about it from a personal perspective, you're thinking about us as researchers and what we do. I mean, after my book came out, and it came out during the pandemic, I had a lot of journalists being like, hello, can you talk about hype and coronavirus and come on the news and talk about it? And I was like, no, I am not an expert on coronavirus hype. I've written a book on this thing, and I'm not going to propagate hype by talking about coronavirus hype on the news instead of having an epidemiologist or whoever else. But I'm not saying I'm a saint, but I'm pretty sure quite a lot of people that are trying to put books out would have said yes to that, because it's very good for sales.
Remember that Elon Musk was saying quite a lot about coronavirus.
Well, I mean,
so there are plenty of non-experts.
I know. But the point I'm making is, I suppose, because I think a lot about like, what is the responsibility of a public intellectual, of a researcher, if you're meant to be this, like, in this job, like, what is it we're trying to do? Like, what is it? I mean, in STS as well, like, what is it? What's the point of STS? What is it we're trying to advance? But to kind of go back to this complicity point, I think a lot about what does it mean when you've seen past the curtain in Jack's picture, like when you see that hype is this tool that's used, when you see that, AI is exposing actually things that are problems with us as humans and all that jazz, like, what do we as individuals then do about that? Like, is the burden on us, the ones that are enlightened, to then kind of only talk about that and to change all of our behavior? Or is it about trying to bring everyone else along that journey? And so there's like so many different layers of like responsibility, complicity, and to kind of think about this like futurism as a tool as well, and the same idea as kind of hype. I think about like the sort of creation element of hype and futurism, this idea that these narratives result in something. It's not just like a thing that's put out into the world. It's like, what happens as a result of these things? And futurism is like a very like creationist, for lack of a better word, practice. It's about creating futures. It's about, I'm going to say something in the hope that I can change the future as a result. So then it's like, well, who gets to do that, and why are they doing it, and for whom? Is a corporate paying them to do that, and what's the corporate doing with that, versus is a government doing it? Which government? They going back to the NSA point, are you like happy to walk into work as a futurist, depending on who you're doing futures for? And also the superpower of knowing about hype, or knowing how to do futures, how to hype, that's a tool. So who do you give that tool to? So it's not quite as, it's not simple, right? I guess is the point. And maybe for me anyway, it's more about how do we just keep the conversation going about responsibility, so that everybody is reflecting on the fact that we are all complicit, without just feeling terrible about it and then not doing anything because woe is me, we're all complicit, we might as well not bother. No complicity under capitalism or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah. I was really interesting. Harrow mentioned the consultancy Gartner, who run this hype cycle, which purports to, I mean, it's a fascinating device. It purports to measure hype, but clearly it is in the business of creating hype in your terms, Gemma. And so it serves this really fascinating function where people sort of use it both as a way to observe the world, but also to work out which bandwagons to get on. So it becomes a self-fulfilling.
It's justification. I mean, right. I've sat in a lot of business meetings where this thing has come up on screen, and it's like, look, IoT is here, so we should invest in it, and it's used as like a data point in order to make a decision. While
also being, the claim is that it sort of has a critical, analytical side to it as well. That we will tell you what is overhyped. It's a fascinating thing. And Charlie asks in the chat about government's role in hype, which I think is really interesting, because Harrow was saying, if you are an agency forced to make difficult decisions about how to reform a system or improve your transport network. I mean, my own work on self-driving cars, there's lots of examples of where people in charge of transport systems have said, oh, well, let's not do the nasty, expensive, dirty infrastructure job that we've been meaning to do for years because self-driving cars are just around the corner. Right, so conventionally governments might be receivers of hype, but do they play a more complicated role in the construction of this? Ramon?
I think it's interesting to think about the military apparatus, and the function of the military, which of course is connected to many different facets of our cultural milieu. And I think of the work of Susan Shupley at Center for Research Architecture, and I think at one point she identified that it takes, I think it's 127, I think it's 27, 127 individuals to operate one militarized drone. And that's an unmanned drone. And so she sort of tries to pick up on then where is accountability? Where is this hype? If 127 people are involved, which part of this process then, if which has happened before, a 13-year-old child is killed, who takes responsibility for that? And then she starts looking at the military apparatus as a whole, and she's concerned about which part of that process becomes the witness to these types of human rights violations. But I think through of where the function of accountability lies. And so actually militarized drone, of course, becomes something efficient for a military machine, but at the same time, it actually becomes something which can generate and generate hype, because now they can position it as, which is what they've done. I can actually save a soldier's life. I can save a human life by making this machine that does it on its own. I can save the human from decision-making and wrong decisions by giving this machine that's there. And then they get this extra benefit, which is the cherry on top of the cake, which means if something goes wrong in that process, now that I've taken the human out of the most visible part of the process, I no longer have to claim responsibility. So we can't actually send the militarized drone to The Hague for a tribunal, right? So, and so I think in creating this hype, what it perpetuates for me, what the militaristic hype is that this is something for social good. This is a necessity for what we call national security, but then it's also for good, because now I can perpetuate national security. I can also save lives. And then underneath, behind that curtain you have there, Jack, is this sort of extra thing, which is I no longer have to take accountability for the failures of this particular type of drone. And for me, it becomes a complicated issue when you combine that with, sorry, I'm just gonna jump in really quickly about, because there's a question from Manuel about if we can measure hype, we can train machine learning algorithms to predict hype. And these questions kind of go aligned for me, because on an engineering perspective, if you look at the mathematics of this particular algorithm, is based on symbolic mathematics, which their purpose is to subsume contingency into one generalization, which means that the engineer, as well as the mathematician, is already aware that there will be functions that fall outside of that process. They're already aware that it's not 100 proof. So when those mechanisms are put into facial recognition for a militarized drone, it already comes with the recognition that there will be collateral damage. So then to train a machine learning for hype would mean that we would have to account for every possible contingency of hype into an apparatus that can only mirror that. And we see even from this conversation, we're all even having a hard time nailing down what hype is.
It goes back to Harrow's. It goes back to Harrow's point that it's just part of the dynamic, though, right? I mean, that's what you said right at the start, Harrow. That this is just this society that we live in, whether we're talking about tech and science or anything else, to be honest, right? And so maybe it is just about having these serious conversations and continuing to question. I mean, isn't AI just automated decision making? I mean, that's kind of how I think about it anyway, right? Automated responsibility. The chapter that I wrote is called Decision Making on Tap for that reason. And I think that that's, if we don't reflect on that, then we miss the point of what AI actually is.
Yeah, and I mean, I also want to get a bit, maybe this is overly optimistic of me, but, I also want to give this a bit of compassion with the human ourselves. I mean, AI has this type of decision making, as I said before, has really put us in position where we're actually able to reflect on our own processes. And because it's so pervasive in society, we want to jump immediately to the solution. And maybe we're not ready for the solution yet because we're just now seeing the problem. And so to stick with this you know, to stick with this messiness, you know, maybe we need to put our head under the tap, you know, to really see how intense we are functioning in this, to even think about a solution. You know, I know all my students, the first thing they ask is, you know, how do we solve this thing? And I'm like, you know, and I'm like, actually, we first have to look genuinely and authentically at the problem itself, and not just stating it, but actually involving ourselves in it. And so something like complicity doesn't have to necessarily, in my view, be something that is guilt-ridden or something that disrupts the process, because sometimes the recognition of complicity can be the avenue in which one can then make better decisions.
Before we get too deep into a discussion about whether we can automate hype, my dog has just started barking, which is ridiculously annoying of him. We have come to the end of our hour, so thank you all for an absolutely fascinating discussion. By the end, we had about 50 people in the room, which is great to see. Join me, audience, however you see fit, in thanking our panelists, Gemma Milne, Ramona Moro, Dorothea Bauer, and Harry van Lente. It's been a great discussion. Thank you very much.